The remnants of light had extinguished. Approximately 15 minutes had passed since the pre-recorded announcement urging the population to stay in their homes and not open the door to anyone they did not know. Shortly after, and what Jack remembered as being only minutes, the electrical service had ceased, the mobile phone signal had disappeared, and all contact with the outside world had been interrupted. Jack left the apartment, ignoring the public announcement, and noticed that nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except for an all-encompassing darkness. When he turned to enter the apartment, the door was closed. He rang the doorbell, seemingly forgetting the absence of electricity. He knocked on the door 3 times. "Sophie, it's Jack, are you there? The door closed behind me, please open it." There was no response. Jack knocked again, this time with more force and speed, and the door that separated the hallway from the interior of the apartment trembled, threatening the hinges that held it. He called out with strength, anger, and irony, "Sophie. It's Jack, please open the door, did you hear the announcement?" Jack waited 5 seconds, then 10, but there was no response. The darkness seeped like fog down the hallway, preventing him from seeing beyond a few meters. It was then that Jack realized the emergency lights were not working. "Jack!" he heard behind the door. Jack turned, surprised, and placed his face just centimeters from the door, betting that despite the darkness, Sophie would be able to see him through the peephole. "Sophie, yes, it's me. Who else would it be? Open the door." There was no immediate response. Jack knocked on the door, and just as he was about to call out again, he heard, "Jack, is that you?" With great desperation and anger, he said, "Yes, Sophie, it's me, the electricity is out, can you please open the door? Let me in." "Jack, is that you?" Again, Sophie's voice came from behind the door. A sound at the end of the hallway, masked by the darkness, made itself present. Jack thought he had imagined it, but it was there. It was a loud bang against a door. The darkness was becoming more present. Where before, Jack could make out the dim outlines of doors leading to other apartments on the floor, now there was only an impenetrable darkness surrounding the area. Terror and a sense of anxiety rushed through his body. He wanted to run back to his apartment in search of refuge and safety. He fell to the floor with his back pressed against the door. In the hallway, everything was silent. The dimness enveloped the space. And his pupils dilated, trying to adjust to the darkness. Jack reached into his pocket and grabbed his mobile phone. There was no signal. He used the phone's flashlight and a beam of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the walls and windows a few meters away. His heart was racing. Jack stood up, trying to understand what was happening and why Sophie was refusing to open the door to the apartment they shared. Jack moved toward the hallway window. An unimaginable terror, like nothing he had ever felt before, overtook his body. Where before he had been able to see street lamps, parked cars, and traffic lights at the corners, now there was only impenetrable darkness. It was as if a deep black cloak had fallen and covered the window, enveloping it, cutting it off from the outside. The darkness now spread like a dense fog, not allowing him to see beyond the tip of his nose. Jack raised his mobile phone, pointed the light into the darkness, and the beam of light got lost in its vastness. Nothing. There was nothing. The darkness had engulfed everything. "It's a nightmare." The incomprehensible disturbed him to the point that he concluded it had to be a nightmare, but he had never felt more alive than he did now. Isn't that what they say? That it's impossible to distinguish a dream from reality? If he were trapped in a dream, how could he tell it apart from what was real? "It's a nightmare, it's a dream, I must wake up." Jack turned back toward the apartment door. In the time he had been by the window, the darkness had penetrated even deeper into the hallway. Where he had once been able to distinguish silhouettes of doors and windows, now, he could only make out something through the light of his phone. He needed to understand what was happening. Would Sophie know what was going on? Would she suspect anything? "Sophie. It's Jack. Please open the door," he said, trying to maintain composure despite the anxiety that coursed through his body. What had happened? What event or situation had triggered the pre-recorded announcement on the television before the power had been cut off? Why was the announcement urging people to stay indoors and not open the door to anyone they didn't know? The questions hammered his mind. Jack, is that you? He felt an immeasurable anxiety and was overcome with a sense of despair and inevitability. Sophie, it's me, please open the door, what's happening? Why won't you open the door? Silence. Sophie did not respond. Desperation engulfed him, transforming into fury. He grabbed the doorknob and turned it forcefully and quickly. He was surprised to see it turn. The door opened suddenly due to the force and weight he had applied to it. He burst into the apartment, stumbling to regain his balance. He managed to avoid falling to the ground with some difficulty. Breathing heavily, his heart pounded against his chest like a bomb, pressing on his sternum. Breathe, he thought. Breathe deeply. He desperately shone the light around with his mobile phone, searching for Sophie. Sophie, where are you? It's me, Jack, please answer me. There was no response. His breathing became frantic as he struggled to catch his breath. His heartbeat was erratic and violent, sweat covered him, and he collapsed to his knees from overwhelming dizziness. Choking, Jack felt like he was dying. Attention, the following is an emergency announcement. This is not a drill. We urge citizens to stay in their homes and not open the door to strangers. Sophie was in the kitchen, preparing dinner and listening without much attention to the sound coming from the television. Her hair was bothering her face, so she placed the pan on the electric stove at low heat and headed to the dresser to find a hair tie. Attention, the following is an emergency announcement. She heard on the television. She grabbed the remote and turned it off. She picked up her mobile phone and noticed a message from her mother that read, "Sophie, is everything okay? Call me." The message was cut off due to the device's preview. She ignored it, placed the phone on the table, and returned to the kitchen. Darkness enveloped the apartment, the power was interrupted. A blackout, she thought. She grabbed the phone she had left on the table and unlocked it. The phone's blue light illuminated her face, but there was no signal. She opened her mother's message and read, "Sophie, is everything okay? Call me, don't let anyone in that you don't know. Please call me as soon as you can." Sophie turned on the flashlight of her phone and sat down at the kitchen table. She checked the rest of the messages she had received. All of them asked if she was okay, if she was hurt. Fran, Manu, and Tyr all inquired if she had followed the emergency announcement. She wondered what had happened. She remembered the announcement but hadn't paid attention to it. Suddenly, her train of thought was interrupted, and she jumped at the sound of a knock on the apartment door. Fearfully, Sophie stood up and approached the door. She looked through the peephole and noticed that darkness enveloped the hallway. She could just make out a figure on the other side, a shadow. "Sophie. It's Jack, are you there?" she heard. It sounded like Jack, but it couldn't be him. Jack had a different voice. This voice was threatening, furious, and desperate. It caused her anxiety and fear. She and Jack had just moved into this building less than a week ago. There were still moving boxes around the corners waiting to be opened and their contents placed in designated spaces. It was a second chance, a new place, a new beginning for both of them. "Jack, is that you?" The figure on the other side of the door moved slightly. And a feeling of distress and confusion started to grow in her, a sense of fear. She asked again, "Jack, is that you, Jack?" Not being sure if her voice reached whoever was on the other side, that figure, that shadow, wrapped in the darkness of the hallway. She turned her gaze away from the peephole, swallowed, and made an effort to raise her voice and keep it from trembling. "Jack, is that you?" At that exact moment, she heard a knock on the door. She jumped back instinctively and was overwhelmed with an immeasurable terror. Her senses, which had been alert and expectant until then, suddenly exploded, and in that instant, she became aware of the dryness in her mouth and the pounding of her heart. She looked around, searching for something that could serve as defense against the potential and sudden intrusion of that figure, that shadow, who claimed to be Jack. She quickly and nervously headed to the kitchen, sweating, and grabbed the largest knife she could find. She positioned herself by the door, her back to the wall, trying to regulate her breathing amidst the situation. She didn't dare look through the peephole again. She didn't dare move a muscle, didn't dare call out unless it was answered with that threatening, furious voice. She was paralyzed and sweating. The light from her phone illuminated the inside of the apartment. She felt that the darkness, which had previously been dim, was beginning to intensify. She noticed how objects in the distance, items resting on the living room shelves, began to disappear, enveloped in a darkness that seemed to take on a fog-like quality, thick and suffocating. The light grew weaker, only allowing her to perceive what was immediately in front of her. Again, the door was knocked with more intensity. "Sophie, damn it. Bitch, open the door." The knife slipped from her hand in shock, and it fell to the floor with a loud crash. She felt that only the door stood between her and the danger. And she gathered enough strength to break her physical and psychological paralysis. Quickly, driven by adrenaline, in the midst of the surrounding darkness, she shone the light on the floor and found the knife just a few centimeters away. She bent down and grabbed it in her hands to defend herself. Terror returned when she heard the doorknob turning. She stretched out her hand quickly to grab the knob and prevent whatever was outside from getting in. A hard blow to the face just above her eyes, the edge of the door struck her. She fell to the floor from the impact and felt a sharp pain in her stomach. A wave of dizziness hit her, and she placed her hands on her belly, feeling that she might faint at any moment. The strength drained from her body. Jack felt moisture on his fingers, as if his hand had been resting on a puddle of spilled water. It took him a moment to realize where he was. The darkness enveloped him, and although his eyes were open, he felt blind and vulnerable, as though he had lost his sight. Desperation took over him. The idea of having his eyes open yet perceiving absolutely nothing, only an impossible darkness, triggered another wave of unshakable terror. Desperately, he turned around and saw his phone lying on the floor with its flashlight illuminating the ground. He approached it and picked it up, shining the light around. Sophie lay in front of him, her back to the ground, motionless, surrounded by a red pool of blood. "Sophie," he shouted, rushing toward her, turning her over to see her face with a vacant expression. He shone the light toward her torso and saw a knife with its blade piercing her stomach. "No, no, no, no," he repeated to himself. Jack woke up in the bathroom. He stood in front of the mirror, which was lit by the phone's flashlight. His breathing was heavy, his clothes torn and disheveled. He floated in the darkness that surrounded him. Catatonic, absent, out of himself, he didn't remember how he had gotten there. He looked at the knife clenched in his fingers, his knuckles white from the tight grip he had on the weapon. With horror and anguish, he stared at the bloody blade. The last thing he heard was the metallic sound of the weapon hitting the porcelain tiles.